Hi again, folks, to the latest Footnote episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
So for this week, for this instalment, I should say, there's a bit of a divide happening between high fantasy and low fantasy. The proverbial, two categories that come up a lot, but I'm not entirely sure. I think I know what they mean, but I'm not entirely sure. And also, I feel like they could be given other names, or they're also known as something else. And so here to clear this up is your friend of mine, Dr. Alexander
And I'm
Sargent.
grumpy because I've got two terms to do in 10 minutes this time, so I feel like I should get double time, but I will attempt to.
Okay.
I will attempt to do this in a whistle is not the right whistle stop format.
Stop.
If I could speak, that would be even handier.
Take a breath. Right, you have 10 minutes.
Yep.
And I'm interested to know, what is high fantasy, what is low fantasy? Go.
Right, well, there have been thousands of ways of trying to classify and subdivide fantasy. Okay, so you're completely right. There will be overlaps between this and other terms.
Yeah.
We talked about when we define fantasy, it's a huge term. It refers to so many different types that most people's instinct is to start to subdivide it. And one of the key ways of subdividing fantasy literature, I should say, because this comes from a literary discussion.
Yep.
Is to define it in terms of high fantasy and low fantasy. These were terms that started to be used to sort of late 70s, early 80s by scholars, so they're reacting very much to the post-Tolkien craze.
And so this is interesting. So there was a post-Tolkien craze.
Oh, right. Tolkien, it cannot be underestimated
Okay.
how much Tolkien has played a massive role in defining what people think a fantasy story is. Yeah, I mean, you can throw in C.S. Lewis to the equation, L. Frank Baum, Lewis Carroll, as some writers that have had somewhere in a similar influence, but it's Tolkien. Basically, Lord of the Rings comes out in the 50s, and the next, well, arguably to this day, has been it's like, what's it? The history of philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. The history of fantasy fiction post-1950 is a series of footnotes to J.R.R. Tolkien.
Okay.
So Tolkien writes The Lord of the Rings, completely changes the game as to what fantasy is, creates a whole industry of fantasy literature, and there seems to be a word for what that is. And people just term it as high fantasy. And what they mean by high fantasy is set in an alternative world. That's a key feature of high fantasy. Often drawing on mythic tropes and sensibilities, so both on a narrative and sort of character level, so using elves, pixies, the creatures of folklore that were once part of kind of medieval and early modern folkloric traditions, and setting them in alternative worlds that almost function as kind of alternative histories of, well, the UK, really. That's what Tolkien intended it to be. Middle-earth is essentially a version of England that never existed in the medieval period.
Oh, so the Shire is supposed to be...
Yeah, it's like the West Country, or I mean, it's probably not. It's probably East Anglia or something like that. But yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Mordor is the Industrial Revolution. The whole thing is supposed to be a sort of alternative UK. I think the Riders of Rohan were basically what would the Vikings look like if they rode horses? What the Anglo-Saxons look like if they rode horses, basically.
Okay, and that seems to me, when you're talking and defining high fantasy in terms of its codes and conventions, its character types, this seems to be a very dominant and familiar, and well, of course this is fantasy.
Yeah, most people when they do think they know what fantasy is as a genre, think it's high fantasy. Okay,
right.
Because as you say, it's very easy to find. There's usually some sort of lowly protagonist in a it starts in a village. There's a protagonist. They get some sort of magical trinket. They have to go on a quest. They encounter elves and goblins and orcs and things like that along the way. We learn about the world. It's all very heroic. There's knights. There's sword play.
Yep.
All that kind of stuff. that is high fantasy, for want of a
And
better term.
what other names does before we move on to low fantasy?
Yeah.
What other names does high fantasy go under?
So heroic fantasy,
Okay.
Tolkien-esque fantasy. In the cinematic term, sometimes sword and sorcery is used,
yeah.
but that can also refer to like Harryhausen movies and like ancient
Prince of Persia.
yeah, stuff like that. So there is a slipperiness with that term, and actually we've kind of moved. The literary circle has moved away from doing that in the sort of post 2000s, and the term isn't used quite as much today, although it's still used and has meaningful currency in exchange. I'm sure all the fantasy theorists would know what a high fantasy is if you said it out loud at their latest conference. The IFAA, International Association of Fantastic and the Arts, would recognise that term. But other terms have come in their place that are a little bit perhaps more nuanced and useful to help that we've referred to on the podcast. But that's probably for another episode.
Okay, so we've got orcs and we've got dragons and we've got that's your
that thing,
the thing, and that I suppose that's a lot with sort of fantasy. And you've spoken previously in one of the episodes about like the genre element, this idea that well actually fantasy is what we point to when I say well that's fantasy, and I feel like what you've described is that's what that is high fantasy is what you point to and go that's high fantasy.
Absolutely, and the problem with that, of course, is that there are lots of stories that are fantastical and have make-believe characters and things like that that do not fit that Tolkien-esque model.
So there should be a sort of other category, maybe.
So that's what low fantasy attempts to describe. So low fantasy, if high fantasy is defined by the presence of an alternative world, and often defined by the use of kind of folkloric imagery and characters. And there's a certain kind of mythic quality. I'm thinking of, is it Northrop Frye's kind of Anatomy of Criticism, where you've got the 4 modes of literature, and it basically goes from like mythic down to kind of mimetic, something like that. Basically saying that, do you look up to the character or do you look down to the character? You often look up to many of the characters in a high fantasy. In a low fantasy, it's set in our world. Okay, right. It's set in a world that is nominally ours. That world could be historicized. It could be, set in the contemporary climate. But what will happen in that world is some sort of magical element will intrude into the world as it is in reality. So, if you want, Mary Poppins.
Because I've heard you talk a lot about immersive and intrusive fantasy, and it seems like these are other ways of talking about high and low fantasy.
Yes, well, I would argue slightly better ways, because basically if you're going to divide it into high and low, that's sort of fine, but then, if you're comparing Tolkien to P.L. Travers, Mary Poppins to The Lord of the Rings, and you're going high and low, fine. But when you start throwing in other books, what about Ursula Le Guin, that has a very odd register? What about Edith Nesbit, My 5 Children and It, stories like that? The Borrowers, there are lots of examples where that kind of easy distinction between low and high doesn't necessarily work quite as well anymore. And I actually think the category that suffers the most out of this distinction is low fantasy, because there are, that would mean Pan's Labyrinth and Mary Poppins and 5 Children and It and Horton Wears a Who. Where the hell does that get put? I don't even know. But there's lots of different things that could be considered low fantasy in that category.
So it feels like, and I'm sure we will do an episode on magical realism, because it seems to sort of speak to some of the things that you're saying. I guess I just wonder, when I'm first hearing high fantasy and low fantasy, I can't help thinking of high art and low culture.
Yes.
And I just wondered, that term, or the terms high and low fantasy, seem to be quite charged in the way that they're describing their kind of constituent parts. So I just wondered, is there a distinction in the sort of kind of cultural way in which these categories are viewed, or the types of literature to which they relate?
That's a good point. I actually would have to do a little bit more research into the exact examples of how they came out of it. Usually the terms are more back to that sort of Northrop Frye thing I was saying. You look up to high fantasy because it's mythic characters, kings, knights. It's chivalric. It's based on kind of a register that resembles Arthurian legend and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and those kind of things. Whilst low fantasy resembles much more kind of modernist literature. It's the real world with imperfections in which something intrudes into it, and often the thing that intrudes into it is a little bit more down to earth. It's more comical, it's more things like that. So I don't know about that, but certainly in a way, when the terms came out, it would have been the other way around, and that Tolkien's a thing that people were looking down upon, and the kind of more the other stuff would have been less charged with those kind of cultural dynamics.
And what about today then? Because it feels like Hollywood cinema. It seems to make both of those types of fantasy.
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
not a
It makes
distinction.
both of those types of fantasy, and I don't think Hollywood uses these terms at all.
Yeah.
These are very much terms used by literary scholars and fantasy fans to an extent. They'll use the term low and high fantasy to help kind of explain what types of books people are to people. If you go on a forum or on Reddit, they'll be using those terms. But as I say, it actually comes out of scholarship.
Okay.
I don't think Hollywood sells films
No,
based
I
on that.
don't think it does.
And traditionally, it's had much harder time selling high fantasy than low fantasy, actually, because low fantasy can be found in Toy Story. It can be found in all these kind of areas you don't necessarily spot it quite so obviously. Whilst high fantasy seems to come with this blimey, we're making a fantasy movie kind of.
So there's kind of industry going on. There's sort of reception going on. You have 40 seconds to give me some interesting literature around.
Well, the key text, if you want to know where it came from, is Zorowski and Boyer's, Robert H. Boyer and Kenneth J. Zorowski's The Secondary World of High Fantasy. That's the sort of a good nebulous text to where they start defining those terms. Another great book is John Clute's The Encyclopedia of Fantasy, which has loads of definitions for terms like this and more so.
Okay, so you've got 15 seconds left. Do you want to add anything in terms of your high and your low fantasy?
I think I'm all right. I managed to do 2 terms with 15 seconds to spare there.
Yes.
But as I say, these are terms that have been evolved and changed and sharpened and things like that. So it's a little bit clunky, but hey.
Perfect, and well timed as well. So
clunky, but hey, that's me.
Clunky, but hey. So as I said, these terms often crop up in the podcast, and you talk about them as ways to describe certain kinds of texts that we look at. But it's kind of good to get a bit of a background in terms of where they came from, but also, I suppose, how they're both in use today. And with so much stuff, it begins in... Cinema doesn't invent these categories.
Cinema rarely uses these categories.
Yeah,
and we'll get into that another time.
Perfect.
You can email us if you want some further terms clarified or some questions answered. We'll do another footnote as to bespoke to your wishes. All you got to do is email us at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com. And it's the same handle for our Twitter, Facebook and Instagram social media accounts. Otherwise, see you on a future episode.
Bye.